Hello everyone! Today we're going to discuss Frankenstein, chapters 1 through 7 of Volume 1. A lot happens in this section of the novel. Victor grows up, more or less becomes engaged to his cousin Elizabeth, suffers the loss of his mother, goes to university, becomes obsessed with chemistry, creates a living being, flees from it, returns to his home, discovers that the being he created has murdered his younger brother, and watches as the servant Justine is wrongly executed for the crime. There are many events we could talk about, and also many themes and ideas we could explore, way more than I could in a 10-minute video. So, I think it would make sense to analyze these chapters in light of the ideas about the future and how we think about the future that we've been developing in this course. Volume 1 of the novel focuses intensely on Victor, whereas the next volume you will read, Volume 2, focuses on the creature. So let's look at how, in these chapters, Victor thinks about the future and his ability to influence or control it. One thing that I think is really interesting to note is that from his boyhood, Victor's own future is in a sense under someone else's control. As he writes, "When my father became a husband and a parent, he found his time so occupied by the duties of his new situation that he relinquished many of his public employments and devoted himself to the education of his children. Of these I was the eldest, and the destined successor to all his labors and utility. No creature could have more tender parents than mine. My improvement in health were their constant care, especially as I remained for several years their only child." Victor's education, well-being, and growth appear to have been the primary focus of his parents. More than that, Victor recounts that after his aunt died, his father adopted her daughter, Elizabeth. "My father did not hesitate, and immediately went to Italy, that he might accompany the little Elizabeth to her future home. I have often heard my mother say that she was at that time the most beautiful child she had ever seen, and showed signs even then of a gentle and affectionate disposition. These indications, and a desire to bind as closely as possible the ties of domestic love, determined my mother to consider Elizabeth as my future wife, a design which she never found reason to repent." From really early in his life, Victor's parents attempted to set the course of his future, to make him the future head of the family, and to raise him and his cousin in such a way that when they were adults, they would be fond enough of each other to get married. There's something kind of nice about this. Victor's parents are doing what they can to ensure Victor's future happiness. And Victor does seem to really love Elizabeth and to look forward to marrying her. But there's something controlling, even suffocating, about this as well. After Victor's mother falls ill, on her deathbed, the fortitude and benignity of this admirable woman did not desert her. She joined the hands of Elizabeth and myself. "My children," she said, "my firmest hopes of future happiness were placed on the prospect of your union. This expectation will now be the consolation of your father." I mean, can you imagine living under that kind of pressure? Victor's marriage to Elizabeth will be the fulfillment of his dying mother's hopes and the consolation for his father's grief. Victor's parents appear to have tried to take good care of Victor, but they've also turned Victor into the source of meaning and happiness for their lives. In this novel, the relationship between parent and child is fraught, intense, and entails ideas about responsibility, expectations, and control. And in this way, Victor's childhood, I think, sets us up for the major event of Victor's life, when he becomes a kind of parent, creating a living being in his laboratory. Victor is clearly very intelligent, even brilliant, but I don't think he's very introspective or self-aware or good at analyzing himself. He doesn't draw connections between events in his life that really might strike us. Although he does not say anything about this, it isn't surprising to me that coming from a home where he was treated with so much importance and yet placed under so much control, that Victor becomes a young man with huge ambitions. He's dissatisfied with modern science, which to him seems too small scale. Instead, he wants to combine the gigantic projects of ancient scientists, like seeking immortality or the secret of life, with modern methods. Besides, I had a contempt for the uses of modern natural philosophy. It was very different when the masters of the science sought immortality and power. Such views, although futile, were grand. But now the scene was changed. The ambition of the inquirer seemed to limit itself to the annihilation of those visions on which my interest in science was chiefly founded. I was required to exchange chimeras of boundless grandeur for realities of little worth. It's almost like Victor is both trying to fulfill his parents' expectations of his future and rebel against them, to become an important figure like his parents wanted him to become, but also to do something way more astonishing than they could have predicted. Now, the novel gets really interesting, I think, when Victor begins to attempt to create a living being and fantasizes about the future he's going to create, both for himself and the human species. No one can conceive the variety of feelings which bore me onwards, like a hurricane, in the first enthusiasm of success. Life and death appeared to me ideal bounds, which I should first break through and pour a torrent of light into our dark world. A new species would bless me as its creator and source. Many happy and excellent natures would owe their being to me. No father could claim the gratitude of his child so completely as I should deserve theirs. Pursuing these reflections, I thought that if I could bestow animation upon lifeless matter, I might in process of time, although I now found it impossible, renew life where death had apparently devoted the body to corruption. Close read Victor's language here. He imagines himself not only as a father, but as a huge and terrifying force of nature, like a hurricane, and also like a god who will, like the biblical God, pour a torrent of light into a dark world. But it isn't only a fantasy of creative power, of giving life and of giving some new discovery to the world. It's also a fantasy of grandeur and control. He imagines that he will create an entirely new species that will bless him and owe him their very existence, and whose gratitude he will be able to claim. Now, what's really striking, but which Victor does not seem to notice, is that as he's working towards this godlike future for himself, he seems to lose control of his own present. As he works on creating a living being, my cheek had grown pale with study, and my person had become emaciated with confinement. Who shall conceive the horrors of my secret toil, as I dabbled among the unhallowed damps of the grave, or tortured the living animal to animate the lifeless clay? I collected bones from charnel houses, and disturbed with profane fingers the tremendous secrets of the human frame. The summer months passed while I was thus engaged, heart and soul, in one pursuit. It was a most beautiful season. Never did the fields bestow a more plentiful harvest, or the vines yield a more luxuriant vintage. But my eyes were insensible to the charms of nature, and the same feelings which made me neglect the scenes around me caused me also to forget those friends who were so many miles absent, and whom I had not seen for so long a time. I then thought that my father would be unjust if he ascribed my neglect to vice, or faultiness on my part, but I am now convinced that he was justified in conceiving that I should not be altogether free from blame. As Victor tries to create a living being, he lets his own health fail. As he seeks the secret of life, he spends all of his time among the dead. As he attempts to figure out the principles of nature, he ignores the natural world outside of his window. As he imagines creating an entirely new species of beings, he loses contact with all of the people in his own life. As he fantasizes about becoming a godlike father to whom a new species will owe gratitude, he neglects his own father. It's like, as he tries to set the course of the future in one direction, he moves in the opposite direction in the present. Now, the moment the creature finally comes to life is nothing like how it's usually portrayed in movies. Nothing like, "It's alive!" It's a weird, eerily quiet moment that I think is even more disconcerting. Suddenly, a huge body takes a breath and opens a yellow eye. But it's also a dramatic moment when opposites suddenly run into each other. This body, the potential progenitor of a new species, is made of bodies of the dead. Future and past come into contact and conflict in a paradoxical present. Dream and reality meet. Victor, who thought of himself as a god, becomes a terrified and almost suicidal human being. For this, I had deprived myself of rest and health. I had desired it with an ardor that far exceeded moderation. But now that I had finished, the beauty of the dream vanished, and breathless horror and disgust filled my heart. Unable to endure the aspect of the being I had created, I rushed out of the room and continued a long time traversing my bedchamber, unable to compose my mind to sleep. At length, lassitude succeeded to the tumult I had before endured, and I threw myself on the bed in my clothes, endeavoring to seek a few moments of forgetfulness. Victor, who wanted power and control, flees his responsibilities and seeks oblivion. He runs away from the being he created and tries to forget everything in sleep. But the conflict within Victor is not over. His contradictory desires for self-aggrandizement and death, for control and freedom from responsibility, resurface, I think, in the episode surrounding the death of his brother and the false accusation against the servant Justine. Victor knows the creature killed his brother, and he thinks about telling everyone about the creature to get Justine acquitted. But I paused when I reflected on the story that I had to tell. A being whom I myself had formed and endued with life had met me at midnight among the precipices of an inaccessible mountain. I remembered also the nervous fever with which I had been seized just at the time that I dated my creation, and which would give an air of delirium to a tale otherwise so utterly improbable. I well knew that if any other had communicated such a relation to me, I should have looked upon it as the ravings of insanity. Besides, the strange nature of the animal would elude all pursuit, even if I were so far credited as to persuade my relatives to commence it. Besides, of what use would be pursuit? Who could arrest a creature capable of scaling the overhanging sides of Mount Saleve? These reflections determined me, and I resolved to remain silent. Victor quickly comes up with a lot of reasons to not say anything, to avoid taking responsibility for what happened to his brother. Is there really nothing he can try to do for Justine? Or does he want to convince himself that he does not have anything to do with what the creature does? Because if he did, he would have to sacrifice his own freedom. At the same time, Victor does not want to give up either his sense of his own importance. He says, "My own agitation and anguish was extreme during the whole trial. I believed in her innocence. I knew it. Could the daemon, who had, I did not for a minute doubt, murdered my brother, also in his hellish sport have betrayed the innocent to death and ignominy? I could not sustain the horror of my situation, and when I perceived that the popular voice and the countenances of the judges had already condemned my unhappy victim, I rushed out of the court in agony. The tortures of the accused did not equal mine. She was sustained by innocence, but the fangs of remorse tore my bosom and would not forego their hold. The tortures of the accused," Victor says, "did not equal mine. Justine is going to be executed for a crime she did not commit, but Victor insists he feels even worse. Why is Victor making this into a competition of who is suffering more? Why is he claiming that he suffers more? Does Victor need to see himself as an exceptional being? As, even in his suffering, greater than other people? As somehow, in some context, always existing on a higher plane than the rest of humanity? In Volume 1 of this book, we delve into all the complexities and contradictions involved in the role of a creator. In Volume 2, we will explore the complexities and contradictions of the creation.